All right, welcome yet again to another one of our behavior streams. Again, another commentary. I don't like the new implementation of, however, they're telling us that we're actually live. Before, there used to be a pop-up that said like, "Hey, you're live." Now there's a more subtle, like preparing to stream, and then over here in the corner, it just kind of shows you a little thing that, okay, we're streaming at this time, but no, nothing that really pops out at you, like, oh, hey, you're live. Right? So, um, if anybody knows anybody that can fix that, can you just let them know? All right. Um, So we're continuing on with our series of going in depth into ABA. And of course, we're not just talking about any ABA, we're talking about the ABA Bears approach to ABA. Okay. Now, just like always, I don't know how long this stream is going to last. And the reason why is, I'm doing everything last minute. And like I said before, it always takes me forever to kind of create these streams here. So you'll have to excuse me as I am always seemingly running late here. Um, well, not seemingly. I am in fact always running late. Anyways, here we go. Let's get started. All right. Get set up here. Wait a minute. This is the wrong slide. All right. Now we're on the right slide here. Okay. So, today we're going to be going over non-contingent, okay? But we're going to review everything first like we always do because ABA is this big giant umbrella, right? It's this giant umbrella that encompasses a lot of different things. And like I talked to you before about, to make it just simpler to understand, we've broken it down into two kind of main components, the behavior management piece and the teaching skills piece, okay? Both are very, very important, but for us, the behavior management piece is critical to accessing the teaching skills piece. Okay, without the behavior management, it's a crapshoot in terms of how fast your child's going to learn and develop and things like that. Why? Because the behavior is always going to interfere with their learning. It's always going to slow it down. So our expertise, our job is to reduce all of those problematic behaviors that will then allow your child to learn at the rate that they're capable of learning. Now, when we talk about behavior management, then we kind of talk about what happens to behaviors, right? Do they go up, in which case it's reinforcement, or do they go down, in which case it's punishment or extinction? Right? Again, this is where the science of ABA and everyday terminology kind of just clashes together. Why? Because like when we think of punishment, we're thinking about like, oh, jail time, like harsh things, like very, very punitive kind of things. Like you did something wrong, and so this is, and in the science of ABA, punishment may not have to do anything with that. Okay. And punishment is just a descriptor for what happens to the behavior. So as long as the behavior has decreased, whatever decreased the behavior is the punisher, and the process that has occurred is called punishment. Likewise with reinforcement, reinforcement doesn't actually have to do with what you do. It actually has to do with what happens to the behavior. Okay. So as long as the behavior is maintaining itself or increasing, then whatever you're using to maintain it is the reinforcer, and the process that has occurred is called reinforcement. Now, remember also that extinction and punishment have the same effect, right? They both result in a decrease in a behavior or elimination of a behavior. The key difference is that extinction is very, very tied into the function of the behavior. Okay? So, meaning you're getting rid of a behavior by making sure that the function of that behavior is not met. We went over it extensively. I'm just going to go give you a quick overview of it. So if the child's looking for attention, you're making sure you're not giving them any attention. No eye contact, no physical contact, no acknowledgement that their problematic behavior even existed. If the child wanted to escape or get away from a task, you make sure that you follow through. You make sure you make the child complete whatever it is that you wanted them to complete, so they get no escape from it. Okay. If they wanted something, like they're screaming their head off because they want that cookie, your job is to make sure they don't get that cookie. And the way that extinction works is that over time, the child just stops engaging in that behavior. Why? Because it's ineffective. It doesn't get the child what they're looking for. Okay. So that's what we kind of all went over when we went over the behavior management piece, right? And then we started to go into teaching skills side, and we started with what we call discrete trial training. And a lot of people's experience with ABA is going to be with discrete trial. Why? Because that was what was utilized in the initial studies with Ivar Lovaas and finding that you can help kids with autism achieve what they call typical functioning by providing ABA services, early intensive behavior treatment. Okay. All right. So discrete trial training, and they also use things called shaping and chaining. I don't remember. I don't think I went over shaping or chaining yet. I might have, but if I haven't, for sure, I'll come back around to it and talk about those things. Okay. But for today, we're really going to talk about how people learn, right? Okay, so we learn like under the umbrella of ABA, there's the teaching side and then the behavior management side. Now we're going to talk about generally like how people learn from their environment. And there's two big kind of principles involved. One is operant conditioning, and that's learning through the consequences of your behaviors, right? So you do something, and as a result of what you did, something happens, and that result alters your behaviors, whether it increases or decreases it. Classical conditioning is learning through the associations that we make with our environment. So what happens if we get into a car crash? Our heart rate might increase, our senses heighten, we might start to sweat, things like that. And so every time we step into a car, we might have those immediate reactions. Okay. And it's those associations that we built in that causes us to have these reactions. All right. Now, when you take a look at those two principles, what you have is discrete trial training is really operant conditioning. That's code. Excuse me, I'm getting over a cold, so you have to. Excuse me. All right. Okay. So operant conditioning. Sorry, discrete trial training is operant conditioning that's codified, right? Like the operant conditioning, you learn through the consequences of your actions. Discrete trial training is a teaching implementation of operant conditioning. So it's taking all these operant conditioning principles and setting it down into a method of teaching. Okay? Shaping and chaining also fall under that umbrella. Now we skip over to the other side of it and we look at classical conditioning, which is learning through the associations that we build. And this is where we have non-contingent sitting. Okay. So discrete trial training, completely based on demands, right? What are the demands of a situation? What does the child do as a result of that demand? And then the feedback that we give on that response, whether it's reinforcement for the correct response or the no for an incorrect response. Non-contingent, however, is completely based off of classical conditioning. It's learning through the associations that we build between stimuli. So I'm going to just talk a little bit freely about kind of like how did non-contingent come to be? I'm happy to report that we found it non-contingent. All right, and it was completely by accident. Like most other great discoveries, you go looking for something, and instead you find something even more valuable, right? So we were working with this one child, and this child, in the beginning, like how I learned and how I did things was all through discrete trial, right? That's the only like real method of teaching that we utilized. Also harnessing like shaping and changing techniques within the scope of a discrete trial. Never really used classical conditioning to teach. So what was happening was I was working with this one child, and we would go through the typical progression. We'd teach something receptively, and then it'd go to expressive language. And when we would teach this child, the child would take like 2 or 3 weeks to learn something receptively so that you can say touch car and then they can clearly identify the car, right? So it took them a little bit of time to do that. And then it took them an additional amount of time to learn it expressively. So about in total about 6 to 8 weeks for one object label to kind of go through all the steps in learning. And with everything, we're always trying to find shortcuts, because when you're working with our kids, it's always a race against time, because as they get older, it's harder to get them to typical functioning. It's not impossible, but the road just gets a little bit harder. So you want to accelerate the process as much as possible. So when we had this kid that wasn't moving at a speed that we were like, okay, this is satisfactory, what we did was like, you know what? Why don't we kind of expose them to items? Like let's choose 10 items that we're going to introduce anyways. And why don't we just like every hour on the hour show them the item and then we'll tell them what the item is, like let's try it. All right. So that's what we did. We tried that. So we're teaching an object label, one at a time in this format, and then we just added this like little adjunct, which is that okay, we have 10 items every hour on the hour. Therapist would just call the child over, hold the item up, child looks at it, they name the item. And they would just go through all 10 items, and each time they'd kind of randomize through those items. Blew our minds, right? In 1 week of utilizing this methodology, the child learned to identify those objects, all 10 of them, both receptively and expressively. What used to take us anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks to accomplish for one item took less than a week for all 10 items. It literally like shattered every expectation that we had. And we were like, why? How? I don't understand, right? In a good way, always in a good way. And so that's when we just started our foray into let's figure out all the ins and outs of this pairing classical conditioning process as a method of teaching. What are the different ways we can utilize that to help kids and accelerate their learning? And so that's our kind of modest beginnings of non-contingent teaching. Actually, I coined the term non-contingent teaching. Technically, I misnamed it. Why? Because there's actually one contingency in non-contingent teaching. Okay. Um, you have to look at the item. That's the one contingency in there. But non-contingent sounded better than one contingent teaching. So that's why I went with non-contingent teaching, just so that you know. Okay. All right. Now I'm going to take a little step backwards. Why? Because we have to talk about some fundamentals of effective teaching before we hop into the actual runnings of non-contingent. Okay. Now, these fundamentals of effective teaching we utilize when we're teaching and using non-contingent teaching to teach. All right. We also use these principles when we're having the child do expressive programs in discrete trial training. So expressive programs are where we expect the child to say something. So these would be object labels, action labels, colors, shapes, where when we ask them, what is it? They're like car. What color? Red. What shape? Triangle. It's them saying and identifying the item. Okay, so we use the same principles. Now we use a different set of principles when we expect the child to listen to our instructions, right? When we say touch car or touch purple or touch rectangle, where we don't expect them necessarily to look at the array of items first, like we would in an expressive program. In that program, they listen, they look, they identify. Okay, so it's a slightly different process. Whereas in expressive, you're holding something up for the child to reference, and then when they look at it is when you ask them the question. So they look at it and then you say, "What is it?" All right. So the responding is going to be greatly improved when you go and utilize these effective teaching strategies that I'm gonna go over. All right. The first one and the hardest one for almost all parents to implement is waiting for the child to look at the card. Okay. So if you have some sort of card, what you do is you just randomly choose a spot. I'm just gonna hold it up here. Okay, I'm just gonna hold this card up here. Now pretend this card has something on it that you want the child to identify. Okay, so you're just gonna hold it up and you're just gonna wait patiently until the child actually looks at it. Now, in the beginning, what's gonna happen is your child's gonna look everywhere except where the card is. Okay. So they're going to look this way, they're going to look that way, they're going to look everywhere. But sometimes their eyes will come over and look at the card. That's when you go. Okay. That's when you go and you start to label that item or ask that question. But you have to wait until the child looks at the card. Okay. Now, one mistake that everyone makes is, oh, the child's not looking over here. Let me move it over to where the child's looking. Okay. Don't do that. Okay. Be patient. Okay. And I'll tell you why we don't do that. When we kind of go into this game, that's what it becomes. It becomes a game. So the child thinks it's funny that, okay, I'm looking over here, so mom or dad are bringing the card over here. Well, guess what I'm gonna do? I look somewhere else. Okay, so mom and dad are gonna go here, then I'm gonna look elsewhere. Okay, and so what happens is that you don't actually establish anything. You just make it funny and a game for the child to kind of like you're chasing the kid's eyes, right? And that is no good. Okay. That's not something you want to do. Okay. Now, then you get frustrated, right? And so, because the child's not looking at the card, then you want to go in and you want to grab their head and grab their chin and move it in the direction of where the card is so that they can look at the card. All right? Don't do that. Okay? Be patient. Okay? Because what'll happen is they learn they can fight you on these things. Okay. Yes. Can you move their head forcibly over to the direction of where it is? You can, but you can't control their eyeballs, right? So even if you're like moving it toward the camera here, my eyes can be looking anywhere except for the card. Okay. So that's going to defeat the purpose here. Okay. Don't make any sounds or noises. Huh? Okay? Don't do that. Don't flick the card. Don't, okay? Don't try to get the child's attention by making sounds or noises. Be patient, all right? Because once they know you're impatient, they're the ones in control. They're the ones that are like, all right, I'm having fun getting you irritated because I don't want to be here learning. So if I get an opportunity to make you irritated, I'm gonna take it. All right? Okay. Now, the other thing that parents, when they get frustrated, is what they'll do is the stimuli is over here, the child's not looking, so the parents will put it right in front of their face, right? They'll move it right there, like right there, right in front of their eyes, like, look at it. Okay? Wrong thing to do again. Don't do that. Okay? Why? Because even for yourself, any stimuli that's too close to you, it gets uncomfortable, right? If you actually put a piece of paper in front of your eyes, about 12 inches away, it's like, oh, that's a comfortable viewing angle. As you get closer and closer to your eyes, you'll want to like, oh, that's unpleasant. Okay, I'd rather avert my gaze and turn away from the stimuli. So by bringing it to the child's face, you're actually making it more difficult, not making it easier for them to look at the item. Right? Now, the thing is, your goal is get the child to be bored out of their mind in that chair so that they can just look at the card, right? That means you don't allow them to stim. So if they like hand stimming, they like doing different things, what you're going to do is you're going to response block it. Okay, you're just gonna put it down. You're not gonna allow them to engage in that behavior. All right. So hands down. Okay. You're not gonna let them play with toys. No toys. No, nothing for their hands, nothing for them to do where they can just occupy their time. If they do, response block it. If they have a toy in their hands, by God, take it out of there and put it away. Okay? They should not be playing with anything. Your goal is like you only have one option, kid, and that's to look at the card. Once you look at the card, we can get started with the teaching, and then you can be done and go about your merry way. Okay? So wait. Wait patiently for the child to look at the card. All right? Now, the other thing that we're going to teach you is about imagining that this big giant bubble that surrounds the child. Okay. And what you have to understand is this stimuli floats on the surface of that bubble. Right? So what that means is that you're going to tilt this. If I'm arranging the stimuli, okay, and if I arrange it to my right, I'm going to angle this so that the child has a direct line of sight to it. If I'm going this other way, I'm going to angle it this other way. All right, let me go ahead and stop the share so I can show everybody much more closely. Okay, so if I'm showing it like this and I'm moving it this direction, I'm tilting it. Okay. If I'm going this direction, I'm tilting the other direction. If I go high, I'm tilting it in that way. If I'm going low, I'm tilting it up. All right. And that's so that the child always has a very direct line of sight to the item that you're going to ask about. All right. So always in the line of sight. Okay. Now, the next thing that you have to pay attention to is how to keep this child a active learner. You don't want passive learners, right? And what being a passive learner is, like, oh, as a learner, you don't have to do anything. So if I sit down and you're the one teaching me and you're like, okay, here's the stimuli, and every single time the stimuli is in the exact same place, okay, I'm just all right, I'm there, I can answer you, but it's always in the same place. You want to always move the stimuli around, and you want to try to make it so that stimuli is in the opposite direction of where the child's looking. So if the child's looking over here, you're putting it over here. If I'm looking over there, you're putting it over here or over here. But it's so that each time you force me to change my head movement and my gaze to where the stimuli is, you make me this active learner by moving the stimuli around each time. Okay. And by that, I mean that every time that you bring up a new object is in a different location. It doesn't mean like, oh, I'm holding something currently and I'm just moving it around. No, wherever decision, like, oh, I'm going to hold it up here, it stays up there until the child looks at it. If I decide it's here, it stays there until the child looks at it. If it's here, it stays there until you're done with that item. Then when you get a new item, that's when you change the position. Every time that you bring up a new item, that location changes. All right. So now we can get back to non-contingent after that aside in terms of the things that you have to pay attention to be a good teacher and to be an effective teacher. Non-contingent teaching. Nowadays, we use non-contingent for almost every aspect of language. So when I started in the field, we used discrete trial to teach everything. And remember in our trial, on our uh, teaching or on our seminar or lecture on discrete trial training, we say in general, like, oh, one item is introduced at a time. It goes through these stages of teaching until it gets mastered. Um, and that was our primary method of teaching all language programs. Once we found non-contingent and we tested it, and we tested it extensively. We had kids learn some things via the discrete trial method. We had them learn comparable items under non-contingent. And it was absolutely clear the kids learned so much faster in the non-contingent method than the discrete trial that for us, it just became the default teaching method for most aspects of language. Okay. Remember, when we're talking about teaching the child skills, there's the skills that the child is currently learning, and that's called the acquisition items. And there are those skills that the child has already learned, and we call those items mastered items. Now, in discrete trial, you're going through these stages of acquisition until the child successfully does a check for mastery. And check for mastery is just a check to see if the child has learned the item. In non-contingent, everything is taught in non-contingent, but it's checked for mastery in discrete trial. So why is that? Why would we check it when we taught it one way? Why do we have this requirement of having it be checked in discrete trial? Discrete trial is a demand-based teaching, right? Like there's demands. You have to do what I tell you to do when I tell you to do it and perform it in the way that I expect you to. In non-contingent teaching, it's just about the exposure that you have and the associations that are built between one item or another item. The problem is that you might have a lot of skills where like, oh, I can do this, I can do this, I can do this, but I can never do it when somebody asks me to do it, right? That's a wasted skill for us, in our opinion. So everything that we teach in non-contingent has to be checked under demand conditions because that's how life is. Life is not about what you can do on your own time. Life is what you can do under demand constraints, right? And so that's what we have is this high standard of making sure the child has learned it by checking it in discrete trial, and when they clear it, they're able to successfully do it in discrete trial, then we consider that item mastered. Now, remember I said that there are no real demands in non-contingent? That's why for us, the only demand, the only thing is the child has to look at the item, because if you can't look at the item, you're not going to pair correctly, right? You're not going to see the item, hear the sound, and match those things together. That's why that piece of it is so vital to everything. Okay. So we're just exposing the child and building on these associations between what they see and what they hear. And in general, we don't give no's. There are no no's in non-contingent teaching, okay? And the reason why is that generally speaking, we're not making any demands of the child. We're not telling the child to say this or do this or whatnot. We are having the child learn through this pairing process, from seeing the item, me saying the item, them hearing the item, and matching it with the item that I'm showing them. Now, it doesn't mean that we never do it, like, so there's a circumstance where one of our kids at the beginning of non-contingent was working great, exactly the way that we envisioned it, right? We hold it up, for some that he knew, he'd jump ahead of us and say it. For other things that he still needed help, he waited for us to say it. Perfect. Then one day he realizes, like, hey, wait a minute, they don't really expect me to say it. So he just kind of like stopped. He just cold turkey. He just decided, I'm not gonna try anymore. I'll look at the item, you'll say it, but I won't give some measure of any kind of effort into the task itself. So for that child, we start to implement no's for when they fail to imitate, until they start to imitate again. Once they start to imitate again, then we got rid of the no's again. Okay. Now, in non-contingent, we kind of decided on, we're going to use 10 items at a time. So 10 items will be on acquisition at any one time. So you might be wondering, like, wow, like, why 10? Is there a magic associated with the number 10? Like, what is it? Honestly, it was just an arbitrary number. It was a nice, like, clean number to work with. It was just like, oh, that felt like right. Like that felt like a good amount. It wasn't like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, right? It's not too much, it's not too little. It's just the right amount. That's how we felt about the number 10 when it came to non-contingent. It ended up being like, oh, we could go through these 10 items fairly briskly every hour on the hour, and that we weren't too bogged down with too much to go through. Okay. So those 10 items are presented in random order, right? So if we have a bunch of cards, what we do is the cards are then shuffled before we go and we work with them, with the child on them. Okay? So they're always in this random order. And because this is a non-demand based teaching, we're utilizing associations for them to learn it. So for us, because it's non-demand, we want a lot of exposure. And so that's why we settled on once an hour. And that has worked out really nicely for us. That every hour a bit You can change it. If your child needs more exposure, you could go every half hour, you know. If they don't need as much, you can go lower. But for us, what we found is the nice sweet spot is that every hour we're practicing these things in random order during treatment sessions. Now, when you choose those 10 items, and when you choose items in general, the first 10 are going to be the hardest. Okay, they're going to be the absolute hardest because this is the first time your child learning these things that you have to teach them. So, what you want to do is one, choose common items, items that they're going to have a lot of exposure to in their everyday environment. And the 10 items that you choose should ideally look very different, but especially sound very different from each other. That way, you make it easy for the child to discriminate and be able to identify those things easily. Now, for every item that we teach, like apple, then we want to make sure that we have stimuli that incorporate as many different types as possible. So we might have a golden delicious in there, a Fuji apple, Granny Smith apple. And what we want the child to learn is like, hey, even though the coloring's different, they're all apples. There's no difference between them other than this color. But as far as the child's concerned, they are all apples. In the same way, we would teach, any other item that we have there, so that this variety of things, they're all shoes. Okay, they look different. They have different features to them, but at the core of it, they're all considered shoes. Okay. All right. So what happens in non-contingent most of the time is we're pairing the item, the visual of that item, with the sound of that item. Okay, the sound of that item meaning the name of that item or the name of the action or the whatever is depicted on the card, right? So we're not talking about like crunch crunch kind of sound. Okay. All right. So here you show the child, you wait until the child looks at the card and then you go. You model the sound of the item. Apple. All right. And in the perfect world, the child will give you some imitation of what you just said. And it could be like, ah, puh. Okay, some approximation. Sometimes the kids are very clear. Apple, apple. Okay. A lot of times they have some deficits in their expressive language and they don't say it as well. Okay. Then, of course, we reinforce them and then we move on to the next item in that category and we just kind of keep on going that route. Okay. Like I said, usually for most of our kids, they'll try to imitate the language that we use, the exposure. And over time, that child would kind of just jump ahead of you and say it without you needing to model it first. Okay. And that's kind of how you know the child's learned it. And that's when you know, okay, I can test it in discrete trial so that then I can move this one object out to be a mastered item and bring a new item in to be taught. The biggest thing though is don't let them jump ahead of you if they're saying it wrong. Okay? Don't let them do it. Remember our talk about how neural pathways develop and like, oh, developing that strong neural pathway when you fire in the right direction. Well, don't let them fire in the wrong direction, right? It takes a lot longer to correct those than to make sure that they're firing in the right direction. So even though they're trying to jump ahead of you, you do your best to get ahead of them and you model the appropriate way to say it all the time.
설거지하고 요리하는 거야. 설거지하고 요리하는 거야. 옷 다리는 거야. 옷 다리는 거야. 음식 찍어 먹는 거야. 음식 찍어 먹는 거야. 음식 떠 먹는 거야. 음식 떠 먹는 거야. 전화하고 받는 거야. 전화하고 받는 거야. 연필과 지우개를 연필과 지우개를 넣을 때 쓰는 거야. 넣을 때 쓰는 거야. 놀면서 타는 거야. 놀면서 타는 거야. 길이를 재고 선 그을 때 쓰는 거야. 쓰는 거야. 높은 곳에 올라갈 때 쓰는 거야. 쓰는 거야. 공부할 때 분필로 글씨 쓰는 거야. 글씨 쓰는 거야. 음식 사도 돼? 아, 구급차, 연필, 반주, 공책, 텔레비전, 구슬, 냉장고, 다리미, 에어컨. 잘했어.
All right. So basically, that's kind of how it looks. All right. Now, if the child has a particularly difficult time producing a sound, work on that elsewhere, right? So if they have a hard time moving their mouths into the correct position, moving their tongue in the correct position, work on that in oral imitation. Okay, build up the coordination of all those muscle groups or the strength in those muscle groups to be able to produce the sounds that you want them to produce. If the child's able to produce it, but the sound's wrong in some capacity, then you work on the improvement in the articulation in a verbal imitation program so that you can kind of make it easier when you do the non-contingent so that they already have some practice with doing it correctly. Now, if the child misses sounds in words, what you can do is when you're modeling it, you overpronounce it. Okay. So let's say that we're looking at apple again. That my son looks at the apple, then I say apple, right? I'm overemphasizing a sound because otherwise he might say apple, up, 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 okay, or something to some degree. So like, okay, when I hear that, I know I need to overemphasize certain sounds. And so when I expose it to them, I'm going to greatly overemphasize apple. You're overemphasizing that sound. And then if you can give me some approximation, I'm going to be very happy, reinforce the child with the idea that as he gets better and better with it, then I'm going to normalize my exposure to it and still expect the child to pronounce any of those things that he might have missed before. Okay. Now, if the child breaks up the word like apple, right? You're like, what? You bring it up, you say apple, and then apple. Okay, they break it up. What you're trying to do is you're trying to speed up the modeling for them. Okay, now there's no good way for me to kind of visually show this, so it just looks the same. But what you're trying to do is apple, say apple. What you're trying to do is just speed up how it's kind of coming out, right? Now, if they still go apple, okay, you're gonna model it again, apple, okay, and then if they get a little bit better, okay, a little bit better, great, celebrate with them, reinforce them, move on, okay, and then what you're trying to do is over time through that reinforcement of this better and better response, the child's responses are overall going to improve. Now, we call this process shaping, okay? And shaping is we're reinforcing closer and closer approximations to what our end goal is going to be, our end behavior. All right, now the thinking with non-contingent, and this is where it all kind of like goes into that deep rabbit hole, is you can utilize a lot of different pairing strategies when using non-contingent to teach. So most of the time, we would use the sound to the visual, right? Here, you can also have the visual to the sound to the word, the visual to the sound to the word to the picture, the visual to the sound to the picture to the word, or the visual to the sound to the picture to the location. All right, like, okay, all right, a lot of stuff in there, but I'll kind of give you an example of what it kind of looks like. Okay. So if we're doing something that's going to be visual, which is the word card in my hand, to the sound, which is what I'm going to say to them, to the word, to the word. All right. So they're going to match the bird that I have in my hand to the bird that's in the field in front of them. Okay. Now we use this approach when we're teaching a lot of times reading, right? Because we want them to pay particular attention to the formation of the words. And what better way than to use a skill that they already have, which is a matching skill, in order to get them to pay attention to those key things that will help them distinguish bird from car from fish, from keys to dog and shoes. So, just like in any other non-contingent program, you hold the card up, the child has to look at the card before you get started, then you model the saying of it. And you model the saying of it, then you give it, the child repeats after you, then you give the card to the child, and the child has to match that card to the item in the field. Okay. Once they do that, usually I like them to repeat the word again so that they get multiple exposures. Hearing it, seeing it, matching it, hearing it again. Okay. And then don't forget the reinforcement. Now, technically speaking, just like with the informational nose, we don't need to use it here, but what we found is reinforcement never hurts, right? Never hurts to reinforce a child when they're doing well. Nope.
아, 심심해. 아, 심심해. 그렇지. 잘했어. 아, 기분 좋아. 아, 기분 좋아.
All right. So the oh,
슬퍼요. 슬퍼요. 그렇지. 아, 잠아. 그렇지. 잘했어. 아, 심심해. 맞아요. 음, 슬퍼요. 슬퍼요. 아니. 맞아, 맞아, 맞아. 맞아. 잠아. 대단해요, 형님. 기분 좋아. 아, 기분 좋아. 좋아. 기분 좋아. 그렇지. 잠아. 대단해요. 슬퍼요. 맞아요. 아, 심심해.
all right. So you can utilize it in a wide variety of ways. And we've experimented in a lot of different ways. Now, for us, if the child can just learn without the matching task, then we go and opt out of the matching task. However, for some kids, it really helps to have that matching task in there in order for them to really learn it. Now, when we talk about multiple prompts, like, and this is where I kind of really came to the end of this slideshow, and I didn't have a chance to kind of create it, was with prepositions, right? Like spatial prepositions, like on top, behind, next to, under. All of those are spatial prepositions, and usually we'll use a non-contingent method to teach it involving matching. So we would have like a box, and then what we would do is we'd expose all the prepositions to the child. So we hold up like on top, we give it to the child, we tap on top, they put it on top. We go through all of them until the cards are situated in all the correct places. Then we'll go through it again, but this time we'll hold it up. They look at it, we say it, we give them the card. Now the card's everywhere, and then they have to match the card to the card, right? Until we start to see them being really good and proficient with it. Then we kind of drop off that second part and only use that first part, and we stop prompting where to put it. And that's our test to see, like, oh, okay, are they actually able to be successful? Now, one other thing that we've kind of learned to do is test when we think the child might be ready. So, because in the US, most of our sessions run about 3.5 hours in duration, we can run about three sittings of non-contingent with the idea that, oh, in the first two, you're exposing right away. You're not giving the child an opportunity to get it wrong. And after this number of exposures, you'll get a sense of, oh, you know what? The child's really good with this item. He might be able to get this item if I don't model it. Only with that item or only with those items that you think the child's gonna be successful, do you then put a delay, a deliberate delay in there, a latency, to see if the child would go ahead and provide you with the correct response. If they do, throw a big party for the child, until they can do that very, very consistently. Okay. If the child can't do it and you still need to provide the model, the next time you come out, you're doing the same thing, which is you're being strong at the very beginning, modeling the correct thing, and then based on the child's performance, then for those items that you think the child's close with, then you can try testing it. Okay. This testing is not a test for mastery. This is just a test that will they take the initiative and they start saying it and start saying it correctly. And only after like several non-contingent teaching sittings of the child being able to jump the gun, say it and say it nice and cleanly, only at that time do we go and check it for mastery. All right. Now, I'm not sure if I'm done with non-contingent or not. Like I wanted to kind of go over, and I still might the next time, like what that might look like in terms of the preposition sitting, so everyone kind of really sees it in action, because I do think it makes a big difference between just me describing something and you actually being able to see it. So where we go from here for next week, I don't know. I suspect I'll probably stay a little bit more on the topic of non-contingent before going a little bit more in depth into teaching strategies, shaping and chaining, and all those other good things. All right. Well, we're coming right on the dot here. So thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking the time to spend with us. Hopefully, we're being of great service and that you're learning and you're able to kind of make these kind of meaningful, beneficial changes in your life, in your child's life, and that it's all worth all the time and energy in the world. Now, before you go, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and tell all your friends about us. All right, we'll see everyone next time. Bye-bye.